gentlemen, boys and girls, and everybody in between.
He's a South Texan poppy poet living that hashtag middle-class gay life. It's Chibi.
She's a little bit Selena, a little bit J-Lo, and a whole lot of Pisces. It's Rocky.
And this is Words and Shit,
the show where you get to know the person behind the poetry.
Brought to you by Write Art Out
and Gemini's Productions. Hola, Raquel.
Hola, Chibi. How are you doing?
I'm good. Poetry. We're here for poetry.
We are here for the poetry and the poems and all the words and the shit in between.
Quick funny story, side note. When I was at AWP earlier this year, I got to table for a moment and try to sell my book. And so I would just sit there and as people would cross, I would just be like, poetry. And you could tell, if they were creative nonfiction people, they would just look over and then keep walking. And then I would yell to somebody else, poetry. And then they'd be like, oh, poetry? And I'm like, it's because poetry is such a niche, right? It's such a special genre that really you have to find that emotional connection with that sometimes is a little harder. I don't know. It's not as popular as fiction, as novels, right? So
it's more abstract. A lot of people have sometimes a difficult time wanting to have direct conversations in a direct type of voice, and poetry really is up to the reader for so many interpretations, of where they are specifically at their point of their lives. Because I don't know about you, but how many poems have you gone back to and you read them when you were a teenager, 20, now in your 30s, and they all have such different meanings?
Yeah. I mean, I just was in a workshop where they used Ada Limon's instructions on not giving up as an example, as a master text, and it truly is a master text. And I've read that poem so many times, and almost every time, it hits me, right? But it hits me differently. And it's one that, like this past week when I reread it in the workshop, I was like, I needed that right now, and really resonates with me. What's something that's resonating with you right now in the poetry world?
So I have it actually right next to me. I read this on the train when I go to work. And it is Sandra Cisneros' new poetry book that she hasn't come out in maybe 20 years. She writes novels. But the title of the collection is called Wound Without Shame. And it really speaks about her being in her 50s, right? And what it means to be a woman in her 50s, still single, doesn't have any children, and her love is herself and poetry, while reminiscing about her 20s, her 30s, and her 40s. And I think what really resonates with me is that she continuously goes back to this woman without shame. Soy una mujer sin vergüenza. I'm like, yes. What I feel like we all have those expectations from our family, what we need to be at in our lives, especially for me as a Latina, my family, they don't necessarily push this, but the expectation in society is I should have kids. I should be cooking all the time. And that's not the case. And sometimes soy una mujer sin vergüenza because of it, but fuck it, I love it. I love my life.
I love that. You live your truth, friend.
Thank you.
Like we were saying, poetry is such a niche little alcove in the literary world. How did poetry find its way into your life? How did, Oh
my gosh. For me, it was, I think ever since I was little, I do remember writing poetry since I was in middle school. And then getting into Shakespeare and the sonnets, and I'm a hopeless romantic ever since I was little. But I think it wasn't until my undergrad when I learned about the Nuyorican Poets Cafe, specifically Mariposa's Ode to Diasporican, that just solidified everything. And since then, I think I just really been trying to find different avenues of how poetry is incorporated into my life. How about you, Brett?
So like for me, it wasn't until college,
Mhm.
because I came up in the theater world, and that's what I focused and dedicated my life to. That's what I was studying at the time, and I was hosting this event for a queer people of color event.
Mhm.
It had like various acts. I remember the headlining act was Girl in a Coma. And then before they blew up to as big as they are now, right? This was
Yes.
back in 2000 and
Yes.
the mid aughts. Oh, dating herself. And one of the acts was a spoken word artist. His name was Christopher Lee. He was a powerhouse in the Austin poetry slam scene at the time. And we bonded because he had some tequila, right? And I was just talking to him to get to know him so that I can introduce him because I was hosting the event. And so he's like, I do poetry. I was like, oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
And then I introduced him. He goes on stage, and the first words out of his mouth, his first poem, and I have this whole poem memorized, was my pussy is contagious and you can't contain this beast with two hands. And I was like, what? This is not two roads diverged in a yellow wood, What is this? And he introduced me to the world of slam and spoken word. And it just completely like liberated my mind as to like what poetry could be.
Yes.
Right. And as a theater person, then I was like, wait a second, I can write my own scripts, my own 3-minute scripts, right? My own little performances, and completely changed the course of my life. Because now that's what I kind of do for a living most of the time is poetry, spoken word, right? And it's interesting to me how people find this avenue, right, and this genre. And as we were talking with Carlos Andrés Gómez today, he shared the story of like that moment that completely changed his life and turned him into poetry and away from toxic masculinity and violence. And I thought it was just such a beautiful story to share. So I can't wait to share this conversation with our audience.
Yes, and Carlos Andrés Gómez is a Colombian American poet, author, and performer from New York City, a star of HBO's Def Poetry Jam and the Spike Lee movie Inside Man with Denzel Washington. Carlos is the International Book Award-winning author of several books, including the poetry collection Fractures and the memoir Man Up, Reimagining Modern Manhood. And here is our conversation with Carlos Andrés Gómez.
Carlos, welcome to Words and Shit.
Hello.
Thanks for having me. Great to see you, Raquel, Chibi. Great to be here.
Oh man, it's so great to have you. And the fact that you're like New York based too really resonates with me. Chibi always gets the Texas poets. So the fact that we have a little New York representation here, I'm really excited to talk about that.
So I want to be honest here. So I'm a diehard New Yorker who said I would live and die and be born and never leave New York.
Okay.
I'm actually in Atlanta, Georgia right now. I relocated 4 years ago, believe it or not. So yeah, after my partner and I had 2 small kids in New York City and we spent 1 year paying daycare for 2 kids, we decided it was time to leave immediately.
As you should. It's okay. Like
further proof, out of the 3 of us here, only one of us is masochistic.
Yes. She's struggling, but she's cute and she has her own place in New York. How she does it, I don't know.
Amen. Clapping for you. No small feat.
No small feat. Yeah. I was just telling Chippy right now, like my super is fixing my the upstairs of my bathroom, and I'm like, it's just cute New York things, right? Like we have holes on top of our ceilings for an amount of time.
And then
and
then she's asking, like, Chibi, have you ever had like issues with that with your superintendent? I'm like, Raquel, I've never had a superintendent.
The super.
Yeah, you don't have supers down here.
Oh my goodness. So obviously we're super excited to have you on and get to know about you and your words. So we'd like to introduce you by just giving a little check-in. So I always like to ask, how's your heart today, Carlos?
You know what? Wow, it's an intense and heavy time. to be a human being and have a human heart in the world that we're in. My heart is actually doing well today. I just took my kids to the dentist, and they were great, and their dentist is really sweet. So in that immediate context, my heart is doing very well, but definitely feel some from so many different angles of the world, feeling a weight on my chest as well, like I think a lot of people do.
Mm.
What about you, Raquel? What about you, Chibi? How are you? How are your hearts?
Oh, I mean,
I can return that question around on us. This is interesting.
Right now, my heart is excited. Today's the first day of classes at Hunter, where I work. Thank you. And I am ready and I'm open. Yeah, basically, I'm just open to this new adventure.
Yeah, my heart's in a good place. You know, we're getting going with season 4 after a nice little hiatus, and we've started having conversations with poets again, and it's always a fulfilling and very inspiring moment for us. Like, this is a very selfish endeavor on our part. Like, we walk away feeling so full and inspired from each of these conversations. So, like, I'm excited for it. So I'm excited to like dive into, you know, like really getting to know you and your work. But what we like to do is give our listeners just a little tease, a little taste, a little amuse-bouche before we really dive into it. And so we start with a segment we call speed dating. So we're going to ask you a series of questions, just 4, and we encourage you to answer as concisely as possible. And then maybe we'll circle back.
Okay.
So first question. What memory would you like to relive?
Wow, what memory would I like to relive? I think the moment I first held my daughter and my son after they were born.
That is so sweet. That's such a beautiful dad thing to say. Thank you. I love it. I love it. We're here for it.
I was very sleep deprived with both, and it had been many, many hours sort of being like the doula for my partner. So I was like ready to, I was not very clear headed, but as present as I could be.
Yeah.
It's amazing. All right. As a born and native New Yorker, what is your ride or die subway line that always has your back?
The ride or die subway line? Yeah. I mean, the 6 is super consistent, but I never lived off the 6. Different from J-Lo. I didn't live in like a upper middle class Italian neighborhood in Parkchester, you know, but I shout out to J-Lo. Love you J-Lo. But you know, I lived off the Q, I lived off the JMZ, Bed-Stuy, I lived off, you know, so I never lived off of really consistent trains, unfortunately. I wish I lived off the 6. But the 6 is super consistent. I think the 6 is super consistent. When I used to work in Harlem and would have to make it to the LES to teach, when I was a social worker, the B actually was pretty consistent. That express that breaks hearts if you're not a New Yorker. Yes. You're going from Harlem downtown. That used to save me because I had a real tight turnaround from leaving my one job and going to my second job. So I'm gonna go with the 6.
Okay, great. Yeah, people don't know that, like, when you're especially dating in New York and you have a boo in a different borough, like the trains will basically break it or
make or break. Make or break. People lose jobs over the train. Like, you see people like really ready to risk it all on the train. Yes. For, like, just fighting the world. It's because they know they're gonna like maybe lose their job because who knows, this train's just stopped in the tracks underneath the East River for no reason.
Yep.
Y'all are speaking a coded language and also talking about stresses that
are totally irrelevant in San Antonio and
absolutely
Houston.
Irrelevant. Yes. We don't invoke that kind of negativity. Next question, my final question. I ask this of everyone. What is your favorite thing to eat? What's your favorite food dish?
Wow, favorite food dish. That's almost impossible because I love food so much. but I'm going to stick to something, one of my favorite foods that I ate recently. So I'm going to say, like, I just love Persian food. So like an adas polo and lamb chops.
That sounds delicious. Oh
I'm
my
having
goodness.
lunch right after this interview, so like,
me as well. Me as well.
All right. And this is my last question, right? We're going to go like old school cassette, side A, side B, right?
Yes.
What would your side A be? And what would your side B be for your life? Like a mistake for your life?
Wow, a mixtape for my life, side A and side B. That is a really, whew. I really don't want to be cliche here, but I guess I can't help myself. I mean, I'm a poet. What do we do? I feel like being a poet is like I don't play golf, but I had an acting teacher who would tell me about this. You know, he said, you know, he'd say, you know, acting and being present and being connected and being responsive and living in the moment truthfully is one of the simplest and most difficult things to do. Like all really simple, difficult things to do. And he was talking about golfers spend their whole life, even pro golfers, and they say, don't pick your head up. And what do golfers constantly do is they pick their head up because it's very counterintuitive, even if you've done it thousands and thousands and thousands of times, which is to say, I'm going to be a cliche. I'm going to be that poet. My side A would be before Martin Espada walked into my high school when I was 17 years old and read from his book, Imagine the Angels of Bread. And my side B would begin the moment I heard him talking and I started weeping in the back of the auditorium in my high school. Because I feel like that side A was me, I think, very much not knowing how to carve out a space for me to be my authentic self beyond all the internalized, toxic, destructive things I've been told about who I had to be, especially as it relates to all the narratives I'd internalized about machismo and a very one-dimensional masculinity that was very harmful to me and everyone around me. And then side B would be the moment I think poetry and writing and art entered my life in a way that I had to embrace it. I think for my own survival, it was an existential question. And the path that's been carved out since then, which has been a moving back toward that fuller, better, more authentic self. And obviously never arriving, but always sort of in movement, hopefully toward that in some way. That was the only long answer I gave. So not concise, but that was my best answer.
No, that was great. We got like a good sense of who you are. And we can kind of enter to your first poem, I believe.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is, I'm working on my second full-length poetry collection right now. And this is a poem that I think I've read out loud maybe like once, and it goes like this. This is called Where Language Ends after Keith Leonard. How can a pitch-perfect word exist in only one language? A color, parade dozens of nuanced inflections in one tongue, but only sing a single hue elsewhere. The slang term overused in Playa del Carmen mean the exact opposite in the high altitude pulse of Bogota. In Japanese, there is a single word that means finding beauty in imperfections. Linguists think the word bully evolved from the Dutch word bol, meaning lover. The word awful meant full of awe. I listened to old recordings of myself at 3, telling my sister secrets in a language I no longer speak. In Farsi, there is no direct equivalent to I love you. Instead, the commonly used phrase literally translates to I know you as my friend, my friends. I do not know the precise day my first language fully left me, but I recall relishing its familiar music like a muffled eavesdrop against a door. I listened to my parents argue as a small child in a language I thought I knew. I would hear each word clearly, but could not make out a single word's meaning. I wonder if the poems matter at all. In German, there's a single word to describe a face badly in need of a fist. In Norwegian, the euphoria you feel as you begin to fall in love when I comfort my love. The first time she encounters death unexpected. It is the sturdy haven of my arms and chest. Only the vernacular of touch keeps her from the floor. In Brazilian Portuguese, there is a single word for tenderly running your fingers through your lover's hair. I'm not writing a poem. I'm running my hands through her hair. On days like today, when the stanza feels like the most suffocating room, I part and braid the hair of my beloved. Fingers detangle strands into smooth lines like the arteries of a map. I inhale the scent of essential oils and shea butter. And there, peering around the corner, a dialect of 6-year-old irises carried through generations, across oceans, the marvel and loss and rebirth of language, where absence became the brutal miracle from which lineage was drawn. Our daughter is up past her bedtime, tracing her mother's crown carefully for the first time with her eyes as though it were a smuggled book, teaching her to speak.
I love that. I love that. It's, you know, like, I think oftentimes as poets, we ironically lack the words to express certain things, you know, and I love your inspection there of language. There's a podcast I listen to called Away with Words that just breaks down language and where it comes from, both historically and culturally. And that kind of like introspection is so interesting to me. Can you talk a little bit more about like kind of like where, like how what does, this is such a loaded question. What does language mean to you? You know, like.
Yeah, I mean, that is such a big question. I mean, and I guess the most focused and maybe constructive and useful way I can respond is sort of through the doorway that poem opened, which is very much the kind of central obsession of this new collection, which is also inspired by that Keith Leonard poem. I think undertaking being a poet is to do something that we know is impossible.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're signing up to attempt to do something that we will not achieve.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that's so, I mean, it's like, I think about like surfers. This is a weird analogy, but you can't like surf perfectly. Like I don't surf, but you know, it's like you're looking for this momentary thing to almost touch something, and then it slips through your hands as you think you're holding it. Because I think that language for me, and also navigating and juggling different languages across my life, there's no way to fully capture or inhabit all the dimensions of the thing you're trying to communicate. And it's also, as I'm thinking a lot of you know, Ocean Vuong talking about this too, it's a lab, we're experimenting, we're trying things, but even when we're writing poems, it's like we're not always, we're never going to fully capture this thing we're trying to express. And I think all we can do is point toward the thing and have people look in that direction and maybe investigate something in proximity to where our attention is trained. But to capture it, I don't know if that's possible. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do is investigate the silences, investigate the unspeakable, investigate the incomprehensible, investigate the things that we know we can't capture in language. And so I'm like upping the stakes on failure, I guess, here, because that's what I'm trying to excavate in the collection. So I think for me, language is something that can open a door for our attention, but there's no way for us to fully capture the thing that we're attempting to, because of all those inherent gaps in the way communication takes shape.
No, I think that's beautifully, like, that we're investigating the silences, and even just like the evolution of language is just constantly changing. And I kind of want to go into, you mentioned that you are a father of 2 beautiful children, right? And you've obviously been writing before you were a father. And
Yeah.
I kind of want to know what that journey has been like, your poetry, and have you seen it change? And what kind of legacy do you want to leave for your children as they basically grow up with the poetry that you're writing with them now?
Ooh, one thing that there's so much I could say in response to that question. One thing I will say that I remember telling my best friend after my daughter was born, our first child, and I said, there was always this restlessness I felt in my body that the moment I met my daughter, it was gone. And what I mean was I felt grounded in a way where it became very clear what the primary purpose of my time on this earth was tethered to. And it was to nurturing the people I call my children as a father. And I think that clarity and also the almost unfathomable stakes of that responsibility are something that are inherently inflected through my creative process now. And I think in some ways that clarity also, I think, streamlines some of the things I think I used to attempt to do as a writer, where I think I got distracted by some of the cute things that I could do that I knew I did well, but it distanced me from moving with intention toward the thing that I needed to investigate. I know that's kind of speaking around something, but I think that's the easiest way I could explain it. The stakes in my life are very clear, and the stakes in my writing are a lot more clear now after becoming a father. Whereas I think before, some of those stakes were a bit more abstract. But it's like for example, I knew, let's just take environmental devastation. I knew looking around me, like, oh my gosh, this is a real dire situation before I became a parent. Now I'm like, I wonder if the world will be habitable, like my kids or grandkids will be able to live here. That's a really concrete thing to think about.
Yeah.
That's different than me at 27 at happy hour in Brooklyn. Like, I wonder if I'm gonna be able to live here. I wonder if like the world's gonna work in 30 years, and then everyone like laughs and takes another drink. Like that's a little different. So the stakes are clear and different.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
Do your children know that you write about them?
They do. My daughter is a voracious reader, and she's actually, I gave her and both my son and daughter copies of my book, like, when their reading was not, or like my daughter could barely read at that point, and now she's like 8 and reading middle school aged books, so she can read all this stuff. And then so it's kind of, and if my work, like my work is, man, my work is no holds barred. So, and a lot of my stuff is rooted in personal narrative and lived experience. So, and a lot of it's gritty as fuck. So when she picks up the book and she's like, what? It's just like, just like a title of some of my poems. So, and then me trying to find a teachable way to move through that and provide context. Because I also am somebody who's very candid, and I want to be truthful with her, but also want to put it in a container that's constructive for her where she is right now.
Yeah. Your own work becomes teachable moments, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned the idea of like investigating things, and then earlier when you were talking about that moment that you heard Martina Espada read, you talked about kind of like what that did in terms of like the deconstruction of like masculinity or toxic masculinity in your life. Can you talk a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like the shorthand of my like childhood is when I was like, this is a story of so many people who are assigned boy by somebody around them when they're 5 or 6 years old. I was a very, very sensitive, emotionally literate, emotionally alive, nurturing, tender little boy. And I grew up in a very violent machismo culture. I grew up in a very homophobic, transphobic culture. And there were very, very narrow, restrictive ideas about a one-dimensional vision of what masculinity had to be. And I felt a tremendous amount of pressure and a tremendous amount of just, multi-layered violence that I think a lot of people across the gender continuum are familiar with. And, you know, the specific kind that I encountered was very specific to, I'm calling you a boy, and this is now who you have to be to become a man one day. And very few of those qualities had anything to do with who I actually was, even though I am, you know, I happen to be a cisgender straight boy. You know, and in my cultural environment, you know, even though sexuality and gender are two different social identity categories, those were very much conflated. It was like, we assume everyone's straight, we assume everyone's cis, and these are the two ways you can be. You're either this or you're that. And they're like the cartoonish archetypes of masculinity and femininity. And I felt so much anxiety and sadness and grief, and it was just very harmful, as it is to so many people. And I spent many, many years through my adolescence, I think, doing everything I could to try to build myself into this archetype of what I now recognize as a very toxic, restrictive notion of masculinity, because I didn't see any other examples in the environment I grew up in. I didn't have any foils, you know?
Yeah.
And so I kind of checked all those boxes and, you know, related, you know, so many different things, a confluence of things. I was 17 and I'm captain of the basketball team and vice president of the student body. And, you know, with the superlatives in the yearbook, I was like ladies man. Like it was the 90s. Like literally, can you imagine? Can you imagine? People did this? I'm like, no, literally we had a ladies man in our yearbook and I was ladies man. Like, how could that, what teacher signed off on this?
The 90s.
And so I was, you said what?
No, I said it was just the 90s. That's all. We just
it was the 90s. Like, yeah, the 90s, right? And on the outside, you know, someone who looked this on paper, they're like, oh, he's very popular. He has all this social influence. He checked all these boxes. He has all, you know, all these different things that, you know, according to, you know, all these like really toxic male podcasters all over Instagram right now. You know, I should have been living my best life, right? But of course, I was extremely depressed and felt very numb and overwhelmed with despair. And then Martina Espada walked into the auditorium for a mandatory assembly that I very performatively and begrudgingly sat in the last row and made fun of him while I started talking. And then 40 minutes later, I was weeping in the back of the room. And I walked up to Martina Espada at the end of it. And I literally could only say my first name. And he looked at me and he saw my eyes all puffy. And he looked at me and he was like, what's your name? And I was like, you know, Carlos. And he looked at me and he said, you're a poet. And I was like, what? And he took the book out of my hand and he wrote, Para Carlos, Poeta del Futuro, Martina Espada. For Carlos, poet of the future. And it's wild because I think it was 21 years later, he wrote the intro for my chapbook, Hijito. And 23 years later, I was the poet brought back to my own high school, the first alum, holding that role that Martina Espada had held for me when I was 17. So like this wild full circle moment. But that moment with Martina, I think, was the first time a door opened to say, you can be released from this really harmful script that you feel like is the only thing you're allowed to follow. And that was the next week was the first time I went to a open mic with maybe fittingly and ironically, like the only openly gay kid in my high school, and encountered all these people like older in college who exploded all my ideas about gender and sexuality and identity and who I was allowed to be and how I was allowed to embody whoever I am and how I was allowed to consider and subvert and transgress so many things that I think I'd taken for granted because that was all that I didn't have models for other things. And so, yeah, that's like the shortest way, Chibi, I can answer that question. But I think since that day, it's been a series of other things of me trying to interrogate, investigate, unlearn, dismantle. But of course, there's no arrival point. I mean, you know, there's still so much deeply ingrained destructive learning that still lives in my body that I constantly contend with as a father, as a partner, as a friend, as a human being, as a writer, as a facilitator, as just a person in the world. It's just like, I don't know if, I'm sure you all might have this too, where you look back on things that were so normal in your life and you're like, that was like horrifically violent and like absolutely pathological. Like, how could this, like I grew up in like violence was very normal around me. You know what I mean? Like I still in my body, like I'm very comfortable with confrontation. I've obviously evolved a lot. But I see a fight happening and I don't feel nervous in my body. That's not a normal response. Do you know what I'm saying? Like I'm very much not someone who's trying to have a physical confrontation, but like, how some people, they see violence happening around them and their heart starts beating, like my pulse stays steady. That's not a good sign.
No.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying? Like that's a sign of something to be dismantled.
Yeah.
and I consciously recognize that, it's okay. I don't even know if I answered your question, Chibi, but
No, you absolutely did, and really a really wonderful story of like your introduction to poetry that set you on this journey now that you've been on for quite a while and doing quite successfully. So I think that's a really good transition for another poem.
Yeah. Sure. So this is actually the final poem in my book, Fractures. Boom, there it is. I'll put it on camera for people looking. This Fractures. I spent more than a decade doing workshops on Rikers Island. All the New Yorkers are going to know Rikers Island. I think a lot of other people know Rikers, which people have been trying to shut down forever. Rikers is still open. At the time when I went to Rikers, working with an incredible organization called Voices Unbroken, at the time, it was the highest population jail in the world. I believe it was nearly 18,000 people incarcerated on this small island next to, I think it's runway 13 at LaGuardia Airport. And a lot of people don't know and didn't know at that time, the youngest people locked up on Rikers were actually children. And so, and I would work with the youngest folks that were locked up on Rikers, which is 16 and 17-year-old boys in the Robert and Devoren complex. Of course, we live in America, so there's all these euphemisms that are used to describe putting 16 and 17-year-old children in cages. So, and especially when it's Black and brown boys, so they call them young men and they call them minors, and they find all these other words to call them, but they're kids. I was a kid when I was 17 and 16. I was a child. And of course, unsurprisingly, most of them are fed into the criminal justice system from the foster care system. So I know so many people write about the social construction of crime. And these are kids who were put in the foster care system and criminalized for not having a stable family. And so this piece is for those boys. And I would make sure, my birthday is 2 days before Christmas, and I would always make sure to go to Rikers around my birthday, very close to Christmas, because that's one of the most difficult times in jails and prisons. It's always a time that heightened violence because it either goes outward or it goes inward. And I was actually there, I think it was on my birthday, the moment that inspired this poem. And it's called Mourning Rikers Island. And it was one of the first times I was in the gymnasium on the Robert and Devoren complex with this big group of guys. And there was some of this group that I would work with for a while. And this is the youngest boys that were there, the 16 and 17-year-old boys. This is called Mourning Rikers Island. Physics and light pierce the hollow stench of the forgotten gymnasium, stripped naked of clocks. All the adolescent boys stop, offer their grief to each other like water, glancing out the only window they all share. A single ray unfolds its warmth across the dusty belly of the thudded parquet. And here's the miracle. The sun frees everyone to sing.
Sitting
Wow.
with that one.
Yes. It's just so interesting to hear about, we keep going back to how your upbringing was very gritty, how almost you weren't allowed to be a child, right? Without all these external factors. And I just can't help but like always bring it back to like you being a father and your children and trying to preserve their innocence and their childhood in so many ways, because you've seen not only for yourself but for other young men who are not allowed to grow up like that. um if you can you please talk about what is your dream right now for like young Black and brown boys who want to go into poetry, who maybe are a little scared to write because writing about their feelings might be a pejorative or a negative connotation on their own identity as well? What kind of encouraging words would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say generally, I had a really, I'm gonna speak about my experience and talk about like my hopes for Black and brown boys, because I feel like there's a connection there that I wanna thread. I didn't speak English until I was 5 years old.
Mm,
English is my third language, but now my dominant language. And I didn't learn to read until I was almost 9.
mm,
And literacy gave me a tremendous amount of anxiety. So I was a very long shot, like, teachers were like, oh yeah, like maybe tell my parents like, oh yeah, maybe your son will graduate high school someday. You know what I mean? Like it's possible. It's very patronizing. And so other things that I did later were very, I think, unlikely. And I know that even in my journey later on, when I, studied poetry, but not formally, because I don't think you need to study it formally to know how to write or communicate. Um, there were just so many people, and this is not an original story. We all know this. Gatekeepers, often white male gatekeepers, often older, often tenured, often in really prestigious institutions, who really did not, who really, and many who continue to, don't want to allow people access. And then particularly if you don't want to follow these canonical rules of how you're supposed to write, express yourself, even walk into a space, even appear in a space,
mhm,
like the literal physical presence, a certain bodies being in a space, they feel like it's a threat to them. And I think, I know, I think there's so many dimensions to that. Like I think about, like there's so many dimensions to that prevent people from even opening that door that I was able to walk through, that Martin opened for me. And
mm,
that's my wish for Black and brown boys, is to, and I've done a lot of work like doing workshops and mentoring with Black and brown kids, but like adolescents, young men, where they're different obstacles that are specific to how people have been trying to gatekeep or hold certain things for themselves and not allow certain people in. And there are different dimensions to that. Like, so in one way, there's a stigma still, less so. The needle has moved in a positive direction, but still there's also a reaction to that for so many young boys, especially Black and brown boys that I work with. The idea of investigating what you are feeling, or even acknowledging there's feeling happening,
Mm-hmm.
is absolutely unacceptable
mm,
and prohibited.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, as a mentor or as an author or as a poet or as whoever, I am always thinking about myself as modeling the thing that I hope to give permission to in the people around me.
Mm-hmm.
So
mm,
when I go to the high school, I do the assembly for the 2,000 kids to kick off the day in the South Bronx at that public school.
yeah.
I make sure that like when I cry, I don't wipe away the tears on my face. And I'm literally watching boys literally like giggling, like climbing out of their chairs, and I don't release them from the moment. I don't release them from the moment. I lean in that moment. I let everyone sit in that silence, and I don't release them from it. I don't apologize. I don't wipe the tears away. I have us all sit there, and then I force us to all deal with that moment together.
Mm, love that.
And I think so. That's one thing. So the second thing is this. Like I got my MFA a few years back from Warren Wilson, and it was the most difficult thing I've ever done mentally, intellectually, academically. I literally never bought anything with Warren Wilson written on it, because I was like 95% sure I'd probably fail out of the program before graduating. And I thought it'd be like really heartbreaking to like have a Warren Wilson mug and not have a degree from there. But one of the things was that just realizing that the ways that some of us are socialized to think that we're imposters in any space, and how much that is such a block to viscerally feeling what other people feel, but because they may have all these other people who've said, oh yeah, we all feel this, they don't let that be a block for them to get in their own way. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So for me, I felt like I was in second grade and couldn't read literally the first 6 months of my MFA program. I remember being in a residency. I was like, I don't know any of these references. I haven't read any of these books. I don't know any of these authors. I don't even know these craft techniques they're talking about. Now, of course, if I was a mentor going back, I'd say, actually, I knew 80% of those craft techniques. I just didn't know what they were called. I'd been using them for years.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, you don't have to know what anaphora is to use anaphora. People use anaphora all the time. You don't have to know what consonance is to know that you wield consonants in the musicality of your work. You know what I'm saying? You don't have to know what prosody is or syntax to know about pacing. Like, that stuff I know. I know how to I love hip hop. Like, I know how to dance. Like, these are things, like, come on. You know what I mean? People are like, oh, let me like make this more musical. Like, I'm a writer because I love hip hop, you know, but I didn't need to get an MFA for that. So the long way of saying, I wish that we could find more ways, and so many people are already doing this, to actively dismantle those walls and those barriers and those prisons that gatekeepers have constructed and reinforced and rectified over so many years, because it's yet another block that can prevent people from opening that door. And I know for so many Black and brown boys who haven't been nurtured and supported in ways where they feel like they can fail, where they feel like they can grow and get and sort of be fumbling with something and struggle with something and have it not mean anything about who they are, that's actually part of the natural growth process. Like, if you're giving feedback to somebody and somebody thinks you're giving feedback on who they are, a person can't grow.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I know I struggle with that because I had imposter syndrome and I was super defensive. This is many years ago. And then when I realized I had like really tough mentors who kept me accountable, but I realized they only cared about helping me grow, and it wasn't a statement on who I was like, oh no, they're only giving me this feedback because they deeply believe in me and care about me and respect my intellect. It's not them saying you're dumb, but that's what I heard.
Yes.
So that was a really convoluted answer, but it's a really big question. And I guess the two things are just like, I guess the two things are like, I want us to be released, especially boys and men, especially Black and brown boys and men, to have permission to investigate our emotionality, and also know that epitomizes any conception of what strength could be attached to, because resiliency can only happen with investigating emotionality and sensitivity. And the second thing is, I wish we could fucking destroy all the walls put up by gatekeepers and just get rid of all gatekeepers, period.
Yeah, 100%. We're here to burn it down. Let's colonize this space. Yeah, I think this is a topic that comes up a lot, especially as the slam to MFA pipeline continues to flow.
Sure.
More and more people that come up in the poetry scene via open mics and poetry slams start to kind of infiltrate academia. It's just going to happen, right? I remember Patricia Smith talking about how, like, the first time that she was invited to speak on a panel about poetry or whatnot, she was introduced as, and the slam poet, Patricia Smith. And now it's like one of the most highly respected poets of our generation, not our generation, but of our time, right? Because she was just like, no, I'm just a brilliant writer. I just know how to do these things, right? And so it's really intriguing and interesting to see where the future of this is going to go, as more and more people that enter these avenues via different entry points that aren't the traditional way, quote unquote traditional, white colonial traditional, and how that evolves, right? And what the future looks like. So my last question is, as you're looking towards your future, right, and the next chapter of your life, if the next chapter of your life was a poem, what would the title of that poem be?
Wow, I love that. The title of that poem, Collaborate, Transcend, Get Free.
Oh, I love it.
Honestly, I was telling someone the other day, like my vision board's really simple. My number one goal is just to build infrastructure for joy and freedom for me and everyone. And obviously, to do that, you have to transform or abolish harmful systems
Yes.
and practices and norms. But in terms of like my creative path, the only things that exist on my vision board is and I've always been this person. This is like characteristic of my career, which I think I was very disparaged for in the early 2000s when it was didn't have a lot of precedence. But now it's a lot more hip. But I've always been somebody who didn't care about separations between genres and always wanted to do things that were interdisciplinary or exploded where one genre began, another ended, or whatever. And I just want to do things that are interdisciplinary and collaborating with the people I love and admire most. That's my whole vision board as an artist. That's all I want to do. And care less and less about what something's labeled as, and just care about like what it makes us feel when we encounter it.
Love it. Thank you. Thank you so much. I feel like I still have so many questions, but you know what? We're leaving this off as a tease. So, our audience can go out and look you up, look up your work. Especially since I feel like our audience really, I know for me, Def Poetry Jam was like my introduction to the world, right? And that was like, to me, that is my generation's like Fania, right? Like the heck
I love that.
We just all want to be there, but we're just too young.
That's amazing.
So I really want to say thank you. But other than YouTube, where else can our audience find your work and find you?
Yeah. You can find all of my social media stuff and the 2 studio albums I did in the last couple of years, and my books and my memoir and my chapbook and all that stuff on my website, which is really easy. It's just carloslive.com. carloslive, one word, .com. And on the front page, you can find everything and samples of me performing and doing other stuff. And if anyone reach out, anybody who knows me knows my style. I don't have like a personal assistant or someone else. Like, as long as you're like creepy and with like good faith, like I respond to anybody who reaches out. I mean, maybe not perfectly. If I'm in a hectic time, a lot of people reach out, maybe not, but I try to be really good about like, if someone reaches out, I will personally respond to you. If you reach out on, Instagram or some other social media platform, I will holler back at you. So yeah, carloslive.com. Got a question, got a thought, want to connect, I would love to connect with you.
Love it. Well, thank you so much, Carlos. We appreciate you taking the time. This has been a fantastic conversation, and enjoy the rest of your life.
Yeah. No, Chibi, Raquel, I appreciate y'all so much. Really appreciate your thoughtful questions and you invite me on. An honor to be a part of this.
No problem. Thank you. As Chibi has said, this is like archival work. And so we're just really glad. And I know I'm going to speak for both of us. We geek out on all of this. So thank you. Thank you for sharing your poetry and your life with us. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you all for listening. Appreciate you.
Hi, Raquel.
Oh, so great. It's so great. Let me tell you, this conversation really brought back so much energy and this transformation of life. I am a new titi, right? My sibling doesn't have a baby, but my cousins, and I feel like, in Latino families, if your cousin has a baby, you're still titi. So, and I really am been looking about my own life as when I was younger, and now seeing this new generation of young children in my life and how I want to navigate and dismantle, right? What Carlos was saying, dismantle and really kind of look and investigate what we can do for these next generations. So this was perfect. I love it. And my heart's full.
And I think what really resonated with me was just this idea of the work, right, that needs to be done, right? And then we continue to do as poets, as administrators, as whatever role you have in your life, right? Keeping the work really present. And, it's something that I mentioned whenever I go and speak at wherever I go speak at, right? That like I keep doing this because there's still people out there telling me that I shouldn't be writing these poems, right? That I don't have that right. So not me quoting my own poems on the show. But yeah, so we got work to do. It's we're this episode in the middle of the day. We got work to do. So
I know. Let's go ahead, Chibi. Let's wrap up. I think we got some listeners to thank.
Thank you, as always, to the listeners. You know, we are here at Words and Shit because of you. We make this podcast for poetry lovers like you, and we want to thank you for supporting us and all of the beautiful spoken words and poets that have been on here. We created this podcast to bring community together, so we're happy that you're still riding with us.
Yes, and a big shout out to Chris Condi, who produced our theme music. So if you're jamming out with us, he is who you need to thank.
Mm-hmm. Look Chris up. He's an amazing queer hard rock rapper from the San Antonio area. Speaking of San Antonio, thank you to Write Art Out and the City of San Antonio Department of Arts and Cultures, whose support has helped us produce this podcast.
Wow, we fancy, super fancy. And if not, please, if you're not doing it right now, or if you unfollow us and like now we're back, follow us on IG, and forever it will be called Twitter. We will never say X. I know we've been thinking about going on Threads, but definitely just find us anywhere on the social medias. And then you can also slide into our DMs. We will definitely go ahead and answer those DMs for you. You don't know, maybe we'll bring in someone that you want to listen to and hear and learn more about. So just shoot your shot in our DMs.
At Words and Shh. And also, if you're just tuning in for the first time or you want to go revisit some past episodes, you can watch or listen to past episodes on our YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, and don't forget to like, subscribe, rate, and review. So we're out here, and please, please, please just share the love.
Until next time, y'all.
Adios. Bye.